Heinrich Himmler himself had reviewed assessments suggesting that British factories would operate at barely 30% capacity once mobilization stripped them of skilled workers. The reasoning seemed sound. Aircraft manufacturing required technical expertise, physical strength, and years of training. Women, according to prevailing assumptions on both sides of the conflict, simply could not fill such demanding roles. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the Third Reich's most catastrophic intelligence failures. Margaret Fairweather remembered the morning recruiters arrived at her Manchester textile mill with perfect clarity. She had been operating the same loom for 7 years, her fingers moving with mechanical precision through the repetitive work that barely paid enough to feed her 2 children. The men in suits looked uncomfortable as they addressed the floor of women workers, explaining that the nation needed them not for sewing parachutes or rolling bandages, but for building Spitfires. Margaret exchanged skeptical glances with the other women. They had heard promises before, but when the recruiter mentioned the wages nearly double what they currently earned, the murmuring stopped. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded in thousands of factories, shops, and homes. The Ministry of Aircraft Production, led by the energetic newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook, had launched an unprecedented recruitment campaign, according to records preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives. The ministry's goal seemed almost fantastical. Recruit and train 200,000 women, within 18 months to work in aircraft production. Critics within the government called it impossible. Traditional military leaders dismissed the idea as desperate folly. Yet Beaverbrook possessed something his doubters lacked in understanding: that Britain's survival depended not on maintaining peacetime conventions, but on shattering them entirely. The first women arrived at aircraft factories in October 1939, wearing their Sunday best and carrying packed lunches, uncertain whether they would be turned away at the gates. What they found inside challenged everything they thought they knew about their own capabilities. The factory stretched across acres of floor space, filled with metal skeletons of aircraft in various stages of completion. The noise was deafening. Riveting guns, grinding wheels, and shouting supervisors created a thunderous cacophony that made conversation impossible. The smell of machine oil, hot metal, and welding fumes hung thick in the air. And everywhere, men watched the newcomers with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Rose Garrett, a former shop assistant from Birmingham, later recalled her first day at the Castle Bromwich aircraft factory. The foreman looked at my hand-soft hands that had only ever handled fabric and banknotes, and laughed. He said I would not last a week. His prediction would prove spectacularly wrong. The transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it occur without fierce resistance. Throughout the winter of 1939 and into 1940, Britain's aircraft factories became battlegrounds of a different sort, where entrenched prejudices clashed with desperate necessity. Male workers, fearing unemployment after the war or simply unable to accept women as equals, sometimes sabotaged training efforts. Tools went missing when women needed them. Instructional manuals mysteriously vanished. Some foremen assigned female workers impossible tasks, then pointed to their failures as proof of inherent incompetence. Eleanor Morrison had worked as a mathematics teacher before the war, a profession that required university education and sharp analytical skills. Yet when she arrived at the de Havilland factory in Hatfield, her supervisor assigned her to sweeping floors. He told me women's brains were not suited for technical work, Eleanor remembered in an interview archived at the British Library. I swept floors for 3 days before marching into the plant manager's office with my degree certificates. Within 2 weeks, she was calculating stress loads for mosquito bomber components, work that required advanced mathematics and saved the company countless hours of trial and error testing. The breakthrough came not from official policy, but from pragmatic necessity. By May 1940, the German blitzkrieg had swept across France, and the evacuation at Dunkirk left Britain standing alone against Nazi aggression. The Battle of Britain loomed on the horizon, and the Royal Air Force was losing aircraft faster than factories could replace them. Lord Beaverbrook issued a directive that shocked the establishment. Production quotas would be increased by 50%, and anyone who could do the work regardless of gender would be trained and employed. Discrimination, he declared, was a luxury Britain could no longer afford. Training programs were revolutionized based on insights that seem obvious in retrospect, but were radical at the time. Instructors discovered that women often excelled at precision work, requiring fine motor control and sustained concentration. Tasks like aircraft wiring, instrument installation, and fabric covering, all critical to aircraft safety, became predominantly female domains. Managers at the Vickers-Armstrong factory in Weybridge documented that women made fewer errors in repetitive assembly work than their male counterparts, possibly because they were less prone to overconfidence and more likely to follow procedures exactly. This data, compiled in production reports now housed at the National Archives in Kew, began changing minds even among skeptical engineers. Dorothy Williams exemplified the rapid skill acquisition that characterized this period. Former housemaid from Liverpool with minimal formal education, she entered a 6-week training program at the Roots Shadow Factory in March 1940. The course covered blueprint reading, metalworking, riveting, and basic aeronautical engineering. Dorothy struggled initially with the technical vocabulary and mathematical concepts, studying late into the night by candlelight after her shift. But she possessed something more valuable than prior knowledge: determination forged by necessity. Her husband was fighting in North Africa and her 2 sons needed feeding. Failure was not an option. By late May 1940, Dorothy had qualified as a riveter and was working on Hurricane fighter fuselages. Her productivity scores ranked in the top 15% of all workers, male or female. When a reporter from the Manchester Guardian visited the factory that summer to document the women's contribution to the war effort, he interviewed Dorothy. "You find the work difficult?" he asked, his tone slightly patronizing. Dorothy's response became famous. "Difficult? Running a household on 5 shillings a week is difficult. It's just work that needs doing." The expansion of Britain's aircraft industry required more than recruiting workers. It demanded reimagining industrial production itself. Throughout 1940 and 1941, a network of shadow factories emerged across the British landscape. Purpose-built facilities that represented the cutting edge of mass production technology. These factories bore names that reflected their civilian origins: car manufacturers like Austin, Morris, and Roots, furniture makers, even a former corset factory in Coventry. Each was transformed into a component of Britain's aircraft production machine, and women formed the backbone of this industrial revolution. Gladys Fletcher's journey to the Austin Shadow Factory in Longbridge illustrated the geographic and social mobility that war enabled. Born in a small Devonshire village where her mother had worked as a seamstress and her grandmother before that, Gladys had never traveled more than 20 miles from home. When the recruiting officers arrived in March 1941, offering factory positions with housing included, she volunteered immediately. "My brothers had gone to war," she later told interviewers from the Imperial War Museum Oral History Project. "I wanted to fight too, even if my battlefield was a factory floor." The train journey to Birmingham marked Gladys's entry into a different world. The Austin facility covered over 70 acres, housing not just production lines but also canteens, medical facilities, and dormitories for workers relocated from across Britain. The factory operated 24 hours daily in 3 8-hour shifts, producing wings for Lancaster bombers at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Contemporary production records indicate that the Longbridge facility alone manufactured components for over 4,000 aircraft during the war, testament to the efficiency of the shadow factory system. Inside these facilities, innovation flourished by necessity. Engineers discovered that breaking complex aircraft assembly into smaller, specialized tasks allowed rapid training of unskilled workers. A woman might spend her entire shift installing a specific type of rivet in a particular location on the aircraft frame, repeating the process dozens of times daily. While this approach might seem monotonous, it dramatically increased both speed and accuracy. Quality control inspectors noted that defect rates in female-assembled components often ran lower than equivalent male-assembled sections, particularly in detail-oriented work. Betty Chambers worked in the most dangerous section of any aircraft factory, the dope room. Aircraft of this era had fabric-covered control surfaces and fuselages, which required treatment with cellulose dope, a highly flammable chemical that waterproofed the fabric and tightened it over the frame. The work demanded steady hands and nerves of steel, as a single spark could trigger catastrophic fires. Betty and her team wore masks that provided minimal protection against the toxic fumes, and many developed chronic respiratory problems that plagued them for decades after the war. According to medical records compiled by the Ministry of Labor and archived at the Wellcome Library, dope room workers faced some of the highest occupational health risks in wartime industry, yet volunteers never lacked. The wages supported families, and the work meant fewer British pilots would die in defective aircraft. The social dynamics within these factories created a unique wartime culture. Women from vastly different backgrounds, or aristocrats working alongside former maids. University graduates beside women who could barely read forged bonds through shared hardship and common purpose. Class distinctions that had seemed immutable in peacetime blurred on the factory floor, where competence mattered more than pedigree. Agnes Hartley, the daughter of a baron who had attended finishing school in Switzerland, worked the same lathe as Mary O'Connor, whose Irish immigrant father labored in the Liverpool docks. Their friendship, documented in letters preserved by Agnes's family, revealed how war dissolved social barriers that peacetime had rigidly maintained. As summer 1940 arrived, the Luftwaffe prepared to deliver what German planners believed would be a knockout blow against Britain. Operation Eagle Attack, launched in August, aimed to destroy the Royal Air Force through sustained aerial assault, paving the way for invasion. German intelligence still maintained that British aircraft production was crippling under the strain of mobilization. Luftwaffe commanders planned their strategy assuming the RAF could not possibly replace its losses. They were wrong on a scale that would alter the course of the war. The statistics tell a story that contemporary German analysts refused to believe even when presented with evidence. In 1939, British factories had produced approximately 7,800 aircraft of all types. By 1940, with women now constituting nearly a third of the aircraft industry workforce, production had increased to 15,200 aircraft. The figures seemed impossible to German intelligence officers, who repeatedly dismissed RAF strength estimates as British propaganda. How could a nation losing its male workforce to military service simultaneously double its industrial output? Vera Watkins understood the answer intimately. She worked as a quality inspector at the Supermarine factory in Southampton, where Spitfire fighters rolled off production lines with increasing speed. Her job required her to examine every rivet, every weld, every control surface before an aircraft could be approved for service. People do not realize how many individual components make up a single aircraft, Vera explained in a post-war interview documented by the BBC archives. A Spitfire contained approximately 12,000 separate parts. Each one had to be perfect or pilots died. The weight of that responsibility drove women like Vera to standards of excellence that exceeded pre-war norms. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign, intended to cripple British industry, paradoxically accelerated women's integration into aircraft production. When German bombers struck the Supermarine factory on September 24, 1940, they destroyed most of the facility and killed dozens of workers. Male managers assumed production would halt for months. Instead, within 72 hours, a dispersed production system emerged. Components were manufactured in requisitioned garages, church halls, and even private homes across Southampton. Women carried half-assembled wing sections through bombed streets to assembly points, working through air raids with a determination that bordered on obsession. Catherine Price's story exemplified this indomitable spirit. She had been promoted to shift supervisor at Supermarine just weeks before the bombing. When the facility was destroyed, Catherine organized a network of 43 women who continued production in makeshift workshops scattered across the city. They worked without proper lighting, using hand tools when machines were unavailable, sleeping in shifts in air raid shelters between production runs. Official Ministry of Aircraft production records indicate that this improvised network maintained Spitfire component production at nearly 60% of pre-bombing levels of feat engineers had deemed impossible. The human cost of this industrial miracle remained largely hidden from public view. Women worked 12-hour shifts with minimal safety equipment, exposure to toxic chemicals, and constant danger from German bombing raids. Accidents were common in the rushed production environment. Martha Green lost 3 fingers to a stamping press at the Hawker factory in Kingston. Rather than accepting medical retirement, she returned to work 6 weeks later, learning to operate machinery with her remaining hand. "Soldiers do not get to quit when they are wounded," she told coworkers, who suggested she rest longer. Her attitude was typical, not exceptional. By November 1940, the Battle of Britain had been won, though fierce fighting continued. The Royal Air Force's survival owed much to the bravery of its pilots, but those pilots flew aircraft built, maintained, and repaired by women whose names appeared in no newspapers and whose contributions received no medals. German strategic planning had failed to account for the most fundamental human capacity, the ability to transcend assumed limitations when survival demands it. The year 1941 marked the transformation of Britain from a defensive posture to aggressive industrial mobilization. While German forces invaded the Soviet Union and Japanese ambitions grew in the Pacific, British factories accelerated aircraft production to levels that staggered even optimistic projections. Women now comprised over 40% of the aircraft industry workforce, and their efficiency improvements drove production innovations that would influence manufacturing for generations. Hannah Morrison's innovations at the Bristol Aeroplane Company illustrated how frontline workers often solved problems that baffled managers. Hannah had joined the factory in early 1941 with no technical background beyond operating a sewing machine in her mother's tailor shop, assigned to fabric wing construction for Blenheim bombers. She noticed that the traditional method of applying dope to fabric created wasteful overlap and irregular thickness. Drawing on her sewing experience, Hannah developed a modified technique using measured application passes that reduced material waste by nearly 18%, while improving surface uniformity. Engineering supervisors initially dismissed her suggestion, but a sympathetic foreman allowed a trial run. When quality tests showed superior results, Hannah's technique became standard procedure across Bristol's facilities. Records maintained in the company archives credit her innovation with saving approximately £300,000 in material costs over 2 years, money redirected to building more aircraft. The contribution of women extended beyond manufacturing into engineering roles that had been exclusively male bastions for generations. Beatrice Schilling, already working as an engineer before the war, developed the crucial ray restrictor that solved a dangerous flaw in Merlin engines powering Hurricanes and Spitfires. During negative G maneuvers, when aircraft pushed over into dives, the engines would briefly cut out due to fuel flow interruption, giving German fighters a critical advantage. Schilling's elegantly simple solution, a small metal disc that restricted fuel flow, eliminated the problem entirely. Pilots credited the Miss Schilling's orifice, as they affectionately called it, with saving countless lives during combat. Yet for every woman whose achievements received recognition, thousands labored in obscurity, performing essential but unglamorous work. The night shift at the AV Row factory in Manchester exemplified this hidden army. Joan Harrison supervised a team of 60 women who inspected Lancaster bomber fuselages during the graveyard hours when fatigue-induced errors peaked. Joan's background as a schoolteacher served her well. She understood that maintaining concentration during repetitive tasks required mental discipline and morale maintenance. She instituted rotation schedules that varied tasks hourly, organized sing-alongs during breaks, and personally checked on workers showing signs of exhaustion. Her team's quality metrics consistently ranked among the highest in the facility, though Joan received no official commendation until decades after the war ended. The social transformation accompanying industrial mobilization created tensions that Britain's rigid class structure had never before confronted. Factory canteens became unlikely venues for conversations between duchesses and cleaning ladies. Grammar school graduates and women who had left school at age 12. Mildred Winters, a countess who had spent her pre-war life attending society functions, found herself welding bomber undercarriages alongside women whose accents she had previously heard only from servants. Her memoir, privately published in 1948 and now held in the British Library, candidly acknowledged her initial discomfort. I was ashamed to discover my own prejudices. These women possessed intelligence and capability that my education had taught me to deny. Production figures for 1941 revealed the scale of Britain's industrial achievement. Aircraft output reached 23,600 units, more than triple the pre-war rate. Germany, despite controlling the resources of most of continental Europe, produced only approximately 11,700 aircraft in the same period. British women working in factories that German intelligence had written off as non-functional were outproducing the Third Reich's entire industrial base. This disparity would only widen in subsequent years, fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the war. The industrial miracle came with a price measured not in pounds sterling, but in human suffering. Dear God. 1942 brought intensified German bombing raids, targeting industrial centers, and aircraft factories became prime targets. Women died at their workstations, were buried alive in collapsed buildings, suffered horrific injuries from industrial accidents exacerbated by wartime production pressures. The official casualty figures, compiled by the Ministry of Labor and preserved at the National Archives, recorded over 2,000 women killed in aircraft factory bombings and industrial accidents between 1940 and 1945. The actual number was likely higher, as dispersed production sites sometimes failed to report casualties comprehensively. The bombing of the Metropolitan Vickers factory in Manchester on December 23, 1942, exemplified the dangers women faced. Alice Drummond was working the evening shift, installing electrical systems in Lancaster bomber cockpits. When air raid sirens wailed at approximately 8:45 in the evening, standard procedure required workers to proceed to shelters, but the production line was behind schedule. A delay that could mean RAF bombers lacking aircraft for upcoming operations. Alice and 17 other women chose to continue working, gambling that the raid would target the city center rather than the industrial district. They lost that gamble. A German bomb struck the factory's main assembly hall, and the building collapsed within seconds. Rescue workers dug through rubble for 3 days. Alice survived, though with severe spinal injuries that left her partially paralyzed. 5 of her co-workers died. When a reporter later asked why she had stayed at her post, Alice's response was simple. Someone's brother or husband was going to fly that Lancaster. I could not let them go up in an incomplete aircraft. Beyond bombing, the industrial environment itself generated casualties. The machinery of aircraft production, massive presses, spinning lathes, dangerous chemicals operated with minimal safety precautions in the rush to meet production quotas. Florence Watkins lost her hearing permanently from prolonged exposure to riveting gun noise in the uninsulated Hawker factory. Ruth McDonald developed chronic lung disease from dope fumes, dying in 1953 from complications directly traced to wartime factory work. Helen Price suffered third-degree burns covering 40% of her body when a solvent fire erupted in her workspace at the Short Brothers facility in Belfast. These women received small disability pensions that barely covered medical expenses, and most died in relative poverty, their sacrifices forgotten by a nation eager to move past wartime austerity. The psychological toll received even less attention than physical injuries. Modern readers might recognize symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in the accounts women gave of their wartime experiences, though no such diagnosis existed at the time. Margaret Fuller, who had watched 3 friends die when machinery malfunctioned at the Austin factory, described recurring nightmares that plagued her for 40 years after the war. I would wake up screaming, seeing Mary's face as the press came down. But we did not speak of such things then. You were expected to simply carry on. The expectation of stoic silence meant thousands of women suffered psychological wounds that never healed, never received treatment, and remained invisible to official histories focused on heroic narratives rather than complex human costs. Despite these hardships, production accelerated throughout 1942 and into 1943. Britain manufactured 26,263 aircraft in 1942. And the quality of construction had actually improved even as speed increased. This paradoxier production with better results, much to organizational improvements suggested by the workers themselves. Women who had spent years managing complex households on limited budgets brought efficiency insights that formerly trained managers had overlooked. They streamlined parts inventory systems, redesigned workflow patterns to minimize wasted movement, and developed quality control checkpoints that caught errors before they propagated through assembly processes. By mid-1943, approximately 1.5 million women worked in British munitions and aircraft factories, the largest mobilization of female labor in British history. These women produced not only complete aircraft, but also the countless spare parts that kept the RAF flying. Every engine component, every propeller blade, every instrument panel represented hours of meticulous work by women whose names appeared nowhere on the finished products. The Lancaster bomber that dropped the crucial bouncing bombs during the Dam Busters raid in May 1943 had been built almost entirely by women at the A.V. Rowe factory, a fact not widely publicized at the time. As 1943 progressed into 1944, Britain had become, in effect, one vast aircraft factory. The production system had evolved far beyond the emergency measures of 1940 into a sophisticated industrial complex that integrated thousands of specialized facilities. Women now performed virtually every role in aircraft manufacturing, except final test piloting and, even there. The Air Transport Auxiliary employed hundreds of women ferry pilots who delivered aircraft from factories to air bases. Pauline Gower commanded the women's section of the Air Transport Auxiliary, overseeing operations that saw female pilots flying every type of aircraft in RAF service, from nimble Spitfires to massive four-engine bombers. Though not directly involved in manufacturing, these women depended on their factory floor sisters to deliver safe, reliable aircraft. The trust between builders and flyers created an unspoken bond. Both groups understood that lives hung on every rivet, every weld, every quality check. Letters preserved in the RAF Museum in Hendon document this relationship, including a note from ferry pilot Joan Hughes to the women at Hawker's Langley factory. "I flew your Hurricane today, tail number PZ865. She handled beautifully, and I knew every component was perfect because I trust your hands as I trust my own." The versatility of women workers continuously surprised managers who had initially doubted their capabilities. At the Armstrong Whitworth factory in Coventry, a young woman named Patricia Stewart demonstrated unexpected aptitude for reading complex engineering blueprints. Patricia had worked as a librarian before the war, a profession that required organizational skills and attention to detail, but no technical training. Yet, she possessed an unusual talent, the ability to visualize three-dimensional structures from two-dimensional drawings. Senior engineers began consulting Patricia when blueprint specifications seemed ambiguous, and she became an unofficial interpreter between design departments and factory floor workers. Her contributions remained largely unrecorded in official histories, known only through anecdotal accounts, in factory newsletters archived at the Coventry History Center. The scale of production by 1940 beggared belief. Britain manufactured over 26,461 aircraft that year, maintaining rough parity with American production, despite having a fraction of America's industrial capacity and raw materials. German aircraft production, despite Albert Speer's rationalization efforts, reached only approximately 39,400 in number. That would have been higher except for the strategic bombing campaign that women-built British aircraft supported. The arithmetic was stark. Britain's mobilized female workforce had created an industrial capacity that the male-dominated German system could not match, even with the resources of occupied Europe at its disposal. This production miracle supported not only the RAF, but also Allied forces globally. Aircraft built by British women flew with Soviet units on the Eastern Front, equipped Australian squadrons in the Pacific, and served with Free French forces in North Africa. The Supermarine Spitfires that defended Malta were built by women in dispersed Southampton workshops. The de Havilland Mosquitoes that conducted precision raids deep into Germany emerged from factories where women comprised nearly 70% of the workforce. Wellington bombers constructed at the Vickers factory, where Rose Garrett, the former shop assistant, told she would not last a week now, served as a shift supervisor, carried the war to German industrial centers with devastating effect. Yet the contribution of these women remained oddly invisible in public discourse. Government propaganda celebrated women's war work in general terms, but rarely specified the technical complexity or strategic importance of their roles. Newsreel footage showed women in factories, but voiceovers described them as doing their bit rather than acknowledging they were the primary workforce building Britain's most sophisticated military equipment. This rhetorical minimization would have profound consequences in the post-war years, when women's wartime achievements were systematically forgotten or dismissed as temporary expedients rather than genuine capabilities. Some women recognized this erasure even as it occurred. Edith Clark, a mathematician turned aircraft stress analyst at Vickers Armstrong, wrote in her private diary in March 1944, "We have shown we can do anything men can do, and often do it better. I fear that when peace comes, this lesson will be deliberately forgotten. Britain will prefer to remember its brave soldiers and forget its capable women." Her prediction would prove tragically accurate. The entry, discovered by her granddaughter and published in a 1992 collection of wartime diaries, captured the bitter awareness that historical memory was being shaped to exclude women's contributions, even as those contributions won the war. Victory in Europe, Day, May 8, 1945, brought celebrations that swept across Britain like a tide of relief and joy. In London's Trafalgar Square, in Manchester's Albert Square, in Birmingham's city centre, crowds gathered to mark the end of 6 years of warfare. Women from the aircraft factories joined the celebrations, many still wearing their work coveralls under hastily thrown-in coats. They danced in the streets, sang until their voices failed, and wept with the release of tension that had sustained them through years of grinding labor and constant danger. But the celebration masked an approaching loss that few anticipated. Within months, the women who had built over 100,000 aircraft, a precise figure compiled by the Ministry of Aircraft Production was approximately 118,723 aircraft of all types between September 1939 and May 1945, found themselves unemployed. The demobilization of male service members created pressure to restore normal employment patterns, which meant women returning to appropriate roles or leaving the workforce entirely. Factory managers who had praised women's capabilities throughout the war now explained that men needed the jobs, that families required male breadwinners, that industrial work was unsuitable for women in peacetime. Dorothy Williams, who had risen from housemaid to master riveter and had trained dozens of workers in advanced techniques, received her termination notice in July 19. The letter thanked her for her service and offered a small bonus, 2 weeks additional pay. No mention was made of the 4 hurricane fighters she personally helped build every week for 5 years, or the pilots whose lives depended on her skill. Dorothy returned to domestic service, her engineering knowledge unused, her capabilities dismissed as wartime aberrations. She lived until 1987, long enough to see her granddaughter become an aerospace engineer. An opportunity Dorothy herself had been denied despite proving her qualifications beyond any doubt. The systematic erasure of women's contributions began almost immediately. Official histories of the war focused on military campaigns, political decisions, and male leaders. When aircraft production was mentioned, the narrative credited visionary management and British industrial resilience, rarely noting that women comprised the majority of the workforce that achieved these results. By the 1950s, a generation of British children learned about the Battle of Britain without learning who built the Spitfires and Hurricanes that won it. The women themselves, scattered back into traditional roles and carrying the psychological and physical scars of industrial warfare, rarely spoke of their experiences. They had been told their work was temporary, their capabilities circumstantial, their achievements forgettable. Some records survived through private preservation efforts. The Imperial War Museum eventually collected oral histories from hundreds of former aircraft factory workers. Though this documentation effort did not begin in earnest until the 1980s, these interviews revealed a consistent pattern: women describing years of highly skilled, critically important work followed by abrupt dismissal and decades of underemployment or unemployment. Many expressed pride in their wartime service mixed with bitterness at how quickly they had been discarded. "We were good enough when they needed us," recalled Agnes Hartley, the Baroness who had worked as a lathe operator. "When they no longer needed us, we became invisible again." The final production statistics, compiled in a Ministry of Aircraft Production report declassified in 1972, told a story Britain had chosen to forget. In 6 years of war, British factories produced more aircraft than Germany, despite having smaller industrial capacity, fewer raw materials, and a workforce depleted by military mobilization. This achievement relied overwhelmingly on women workers, who by war's end constituted approximately 60% of aircraft industry employees. They had built fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. They had mastered complex technical skills, improved production processes, and maintained quality standards under conditions that would be considered intolerable today. They had died at their workstations, suffered permanent injuries, and sacrificed years of their lives to a national cause. Germany's calculation that British aircraft production would collapse without men had proven catastrophically wrong. The Third Reich's military planners had assumed women could not perform industrial work, acquiring technical skill and physical endurance. They had dismissed